Thank you for joining us for another edition of Questtec Tech Talk. I'm Ben Coutee here with Questtec. I'm joined with Jordan Bunting this morning.
Hey, good morning, Ben.
Good morning. Jordan has prepared another topic for you guys, and we're talking about special coating on our glass-trac gauges, something that comes up more often than you would think, I think it's one of the things that we have an opportunity to do more of if a salesman really understands, what the value in it is or where they should see it. So let's get right into it. Jordan, where does this typically apply? And if you want to give like a brief description of what we're talking about or what people should be focused on as we get into it.
Yeah, I think traditionally people think of special coating with all of our offshore business, like a 3-coat paint system. But there's a lot outside of that. So this would obviously apply to those sort of offshore applications, but this would apply to refineries or certain accounts that are built in a coastal region. So it could even be a power plant. I was at a power facility a few months ago where it was built on the coast, and they had a lot of corrosion issues there. So it's just something to kind of be aware of. But those are the sort of accounts. Refineries that are coastal plants, refineries in general when we're talking about corrosion under insulation, and engineering firms that would support those sort of accounts.
Right, chemical plants as well.
Yep.
I think sometimes you'll see them just to specify the type of unit it might be on or what service it's under.
Yep.
May apply some type of coating. Okay, so typically I think people go immediately towards offshore coating, and that is a big part of it. We talk about all the refineries on the West Coast, the East Coast, here in the South. You mentioned engineering firms. Who else, even within the plant, are we typically talking to about these things?
I would say plant engineers, planners. A lot of the work that we do, the planner is the main person that's coordinating the job, and it's important to talk about it because doing special coating adds to the lead time of the job. So, planners are they play a big role in it. Outside of that, the general plant engineers, instrument engineers, reliability guys,
designers. Yeah, I think planners, for everything that we talk about, it's kind of where I start within the refinery, and these things quickly turn into, okay, we got to get an engineer involved because a planner just looks at what's in front of them. It might be a gauge that was already in service, and you notice the type of corrosion it's under and something that we can offer, or we might see that it already has a coating, and we need to get involved and figure out what type of coating it is, what the spec is.
Yep.
Talk about specs a little bit. Is that something that, in your experience, that you have to bring to the table, or when you're seeing these things, they typically have a spec that we have to adhere to as far as coating?
Yeah, so in a refinery setting, that's where we would be coating to their spec. So a refinery will have much like their piping specs, they'll have the coating specs for all that piping. And when we're looking at their coating spec, it'll list all the different categories, and that's what we're looking for. Piping and specifically piping under insulation. That's kind of the go-to area. And when we're talking with the customer about getting their paint specs so that way we can coat the job to their requirements, we want the refinery to tell us what paint system. So within their coating spec, they might have, 10 to 15 different paint systems. So that's where we want them to tell us what paint system. We can always review their paint specs and say, hey, this is the one that we believe is the spec we should follow. Can you confirm? So we always want a mutual agreement on that.
Yeah, absolutely. When in the process, and we've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but maybe from the plant level and then from the engineering side, as far as some of the major engineering firms, when in the process should we be looking at this or
Yeah, so I would say, right from the get-go. So if you have an RFQ, you're working with the planners, they give you the initial information, and it's good to establish, do we need to do coating or not? And, lead time can factor in. So if it's a planner and they're saying, hey, I need this gauge in 2 weeks, the best bet is to, establish that we are not doing coating on that job, because there's just no way that, we can build a custom gauge, get it coated, and ship in 2 weeks. Now, maybe there's a chance we could do it depending on the case, but if it's an expedited job and there's an option for the customer to get the equipment quicker, avoiding doing the coating at the sight glass vendor is the way to go. They can always coat it in the field later.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm used to seeing. I mean, if you're talking about a rush application, they'll take it.
Yep.
I think, like you talked about right up front, even within a refinery, to ask the question is just maybe one of the questions that we should have on our list.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about getting an RFQ, it's one of the first things we come back with. Is there a special coating required, or is our normal paint system going to be okay?
Yep.
And I think that sparks a question on the end user side to say, well, can you send me your paint spec? Just that's something they don't typically ask for, but if we ask the question and probe them, then they usually want to see what we do. And I've never seen anyone have an issue with our paint spec. It gets them thinking about what they actually need in the field.
Yep. And a lot of the work we do at refineries, it's because the equipment is corroded and the wall thickness of the material is too thin and the equipment needs to get replaced. And, when you see a heavily corroded sight glass, that should kind of trigger, hey, we're obviously seeing corrosion under insulation issues. Is there a coating spec that you want us to bring into the mix with the replacement equipment? Yeah. So that's kind of another when. If you see corrosion under insulation, they may want that special coating.
Absolutely. You've talked about it a little bit. Corrosion under insulation. Why would somebody want to look at special coating just in general across a lot of our applications?
Yeah, so if somebody is running into corrosion issues or corrosion under insulation issues, that's going to cause the life expectancy of the equipment to greatly reduce. And if you do have a gauge that has more of a premium coating on it, that's going to prolong the life expectancy of the equipment. So, it can be based on the life expectancy of the equipment, and it can also be based on, just satisfying the requirements of the plant. They have coating specs on the piping. They may or may not realize that, hey, I can get that sight glass to match the coating that's on the adjacent piping. So that's kind of my take on that.
Absolutely. You mentioned coastal applications. What within a coastal application causes issues for the gauges typically, and why on all the offshore applications we do we typically have that 3-coat system?
Yep. So it's the salt particulates in the air. So as that everybody knows, salt is heavily corrosive. So if the equipment is made out of carbon steel and it's in that environment, it's going to get attacked by that salt in the air, and it's just going to corrode extremely fast. So I've even seen refineries that are built in a coastal environment. They've even wanted stainless to have special coating. So I've seen some oddball or intricate requirements before, but I've had a magnetic gauge job where the whole thing was built out of 316 stainless, and they required a TSA coating in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned stainless. I see that a lot, especially within the refineries. You talk about the coastal applications. Typically, you kind of have the option to either, are we looking at a special coating, or are we just going to specify the thing is all stainless? Are you seeing a lot of that, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's an option for offshore applications. We see that quite a bit, is if you're quoting a job and it's going to an offshore platform, it's going to be constructed out of all 316. So my view, 316 would be much better versus carbon steel that has offshore coating, just for the scratch resistance and the durability of it. So, is doing carbon steel with offshore coating, that's not inexpensive. That's not that cheap. All 316 construction is just a little bit more.
Right, absolutely. I think you talk about lead time as well. It could be one of the things that heavily plays into that is if there is a heavy corrosion and it's not under insulation, it might be that salt air. Doing something like 316 might allow us to react faster to getting something in the field versus worried about the type of coating system that's on it.
Yep. Yeah, because anytime we coat or paint anything here at Questtec, it has to dry in order for us to package it. So there's that little factor of it too. So 316, like you're saying, could be a quicker option.
Let's talk a little bit about how we execute these things, just from the quote perspective to how they land in the field. What's the how and what's behind that here within the building. Yeah,
so we're going to build a job file. In that job file is going to have the coating requirements if that's required. A lot of these type of jobs are more high-end jobs. They're going to have approval drawings, and ultimate goal is to have that approval drawing list out the coating requirements that, yes, the coating has to, or the gauge has to be coated, per blah, blah, blah spec, and then here's the paint system. So you want all that information called out on the drawing. And then that's also going to be factored into the quoting lead time. So you always want to have those coating requirements when we're doing the quote, so that way the customer, that's all captured and the customer gets an accurate lead time and they can plan accordingly. So kind of starts at the quote, gets built into the order entry once the order is placed, and then when we build the sight glass, all the machining's done, the gauge is assembled, and then it's blasted as an assembly, and then coated after that. And then the equipment is staged for drying, and then once it's done drying, that's when we can kind of do the final QC of everything, and then get it packaged for shipment.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of that final stage, especially within the QC. I've noticed when we have, a lot of gauges that include offshore coating, and if they are like welded assemblies, custom type assemblies that we're doing for the refineries, typically there is a kind of a song and dance, that's involved here as far as how we get those back and do a final hydro on them. Mm-hmm. I mean, something as simple as that. Mm-hmm. Because, let's talk a little bit about just briefly what we do here in-house coating-wise, and then what we do outside of the building. And, it's also a value for us being right here in Houston, because our third-party, coaters, if we need them, are right down the road.
Yep. So our standard coating is just a really basic way of providing temporary corrosion resistance on the gauge. So our standard Questtec coating for glass-trac, it's not some high-end premium finish. And I will say that we do have options that we do here in the building as far as standard paint versus high temperature paint. And that's another thing to look at is, if you're doing a glass-trac assembly and it's in high temperature service, it's got aluminosilicate glass, you really should be using our Questtec high temperature paint. So that's just kind of another little thing that we can talk about.
Yeah, one of the things I had on my list to cover was we talk about piping specs and seeing some of the requirements within those. We talk about insulated pipe. Mm-hmm. If a piping spec is broken into two categories, insulated or non-insulated, correct me if I'm wrong, we're typically going to follow the insulated pipe paint system because it gives the customer the biggest fail-safe and covers us as well, to know that we've given them something that should work. Yeah, and for us, we may or may not know whether it's going to be insulated, so it's kind of a safer approach for us to just assume it's going to be insulated and then, follow that requirement. Yeah, definitely. Well, for me, that's what I had on my list. I'll give you a couple minutes if there's anything specifically that you wanted to mention that we didn't cover. Mm-hmm. For me, I think it's one of the things that, we just try to continue to push on our channel to make sure we're asking the questions up front. It adds value to the customer in a way that they're not used to seeing from sight glass typically. Yeah. So if you're a salesperson and, you're covering refineries, you're covering, coastal accounts, engineering companies that are supporting those sort of accounts, it's a good thing to have in the back of your head to check that box that you ask that question.
So it just kind of makes you stand out, and it can make you, it can just put you in a position that it shows that you know what you're talking about, that shows that you care about meeting all the requirements at a facility, and it's just good communication. You know, is there special coating? Yes or no? And it helps you, process a job much more efficiently. And then outside of just special coating in general, we also have options for TSA coating. So I've seen that a little bit more and more with certain accounts. So TSA coating is thermally sprayed aluminum, and it's a different process. It's not a paint. It's not solvent based material. It's exactly how the name sounds. So thermally sprayed aluminum. They basically atomize metal with a flame spray and coat the gauge in this atomized metal, so you now have a thin coating of aluminum on the entire sight glass. So if you do have any accounts that have TSA requirements, that's an easy, quick yes for us.
Absolutely.
So, but that's about it. Just want to cover our non-standard coating options and TSA coating.
Great. Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And as always, if you're listening and there's anything you want Jordan and I to go over, please, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Jordan.